Hello everybody, hopefully you can all hear me. So we'll get started with tonight's webinar. Okay, so some of you may have come along to my last one, which was about rider problems in particular. So tonight I'm going to be concentrating on rider confidence and how your position and balance affects that. Just for those of you that haven't come across me before, just very briefly so that you know where I'm coming from. I've taught riding for many years. I've been a board member of Horse Safety Australia, a not-for-profit organisation, for many years. I've been a member of the International Society for Equitation Science since it started, and I'm the author of Horse Safe and Horse Rider's Mechanic Workbook 1 and Horse Rider's Mechanic Workbook 2, which have only just been published. So rider biomechanics initially looks at the rider in detail rather than the horse-rider combination. So it's about looking at riders, and so it's taking it right back a step, before how the rider and horse interact. I mean, it does cover that to some extent as well, but it's about looking at the rider in detail. So most of you have seen a picture like this where you have a rider sitting pretty on a horse and the imaginary straight lines being drawn on the rider. And we need to try and achieve that position, not just because it looks pretty, but because it's balanced. When you're sitting in this way, then you are balanced across your horse. Then that means that you are easier to carry for your horse, so it makes you a much easier passenger for your horse because you're balanced rather than your horse having to carry something that's unbalanced. It also means then that you can apply the aids correctly, so it lines you up so that you can use your hands and arms correctly, and also your legs. It means that your legs are in just the right position to apply the aids. So for instance, if your legs are stuck straight forward, you actually have to move them a long way in order to give a leg aid, for instance. But also, and particularly to do with the subject that we're talking about tonight, when you're in this balanced position, you are much more secure and therefore much safer as a rider. So everybody should be trying to achieve this balanced position for many reasons, but in particular, if you want to improve your confidence, then you need to be sitting correctly. So your confidence issues, the problems with confidence issues are that they can unravel your riding ability. So by that I'm meaning that even if you're quite a good rider, once your confidence starts to affect you, then you can no longer do some of the things that, for instance, you might have been able to do before. And it can lead to a downward spiral of events. So when you lose your confidence, you don't ride as well, your horse doesn't go as well, which leads to you losing even more confidence and so on. So it can become a downward spiral, unfortunately. It is possible to get your confidence back, but you also need to be realistic. Remember, ignorance is bliss. And by that, what I mean is that for people who rode as a child, often they have an unrealistic expectation of what they might be able to achieve, for instance. So as a child, you might have been able to ride, for instance, such as like on the picture bottom left, for instance. But as an adult, as a 50 or 60-year-old or whatever, then it's probably unrealistic to expect that you might be able to ride like that again. But by the same token, you should be able to regain your confidence if you're riding a good horse in the right situation. Then there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get your confidence back. But most of all, an insecure seat leads to confidence issues, and that's what we're going to be talking about in particular tonight. So obviously there's lots of other things that affect your confidence, such as being overhorsed, riding in the wrong company, and so on. But tonight we're going to be talking about how an insecure seat leads to confidence issues in particular. And that there's actually an article on the subject of your confidence on the Horse Rider's Mechanic website, and that talks a lot about some of those other issues. So have a read of that when you get a chance. So a lack of independent seat, the symptoms include such as losing your stirrups, and by that I don't necessarily mean the stirrups coming right off your feet. So that picture top right there is a good example, is in that the rider has lost their relationship with the stirrups. So the stirrups start to clatter around on the feet, They don't necessarily come off the feet, but they are no longer working as they're meant to. So that can happen. Hands that won't stay still. I won't be talking about hands particularly tonight. Sorry, I'll just take a drink. But because your hands staying still are the last thing to come correct. By that I mean that you have to gain an independent seat, your lower legs have to be working properly and so on, and before you can hope to have still hands. So hands that move are just a symptom of a rider not having an independent seat. Gripping with the knees, again a downward spiral event, because what riders do is grip with the knees, which just makes them less secure rather than more secure. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Wobbly, or what I call disengaged legs, so picture on the bottom right there, it's a good example of disengaged legs. Again, I'll be talking about that in detail tonight. And bouncing is a result of all these things happening. And again, all these things are creating this vicious circle where the more they happen, the more confidence you lose, and the more they happen. So we have to turn that around so that they stop happening. So when you have an independent seat, you can use any part of your body without it affecting another part. So that means that you can give a leg aid, for instance, and your hands will stay perfectly still. For an example of a rider that doesn't have an independent seat, watch any beginner rider and notice how when they use their legs, their hands shoot up in the air, for example. So that's very common with an absolute beginner rider, and vice versa. So if they use their hands, their legs will tend to swing backwards and they'll lose balance. So watching beginner riders is a good reminder, for one, of how far you've come if you've been learning to ride for a while, but still it's good to actually watch what actually happens, because even in experienced riders these things can still be happening, even if it's to a much smaller degree. An independent seat starts with a stable lower leg. So even though it's called an independent seat, the way that you gain an independent seat starts from your feet and works upwards. So yes, it is about the seat, in that when you have an independent seat, all your limbs can move independently of each other and so on. But how you gain that independent seat means that you have to initially start with working on your lower legs and then working upwards. And that's what I'll be talking about in this webinar in a bit more detail tonight. So your lower legs are your anchors, and I cannot stress this enough. So if you look at these two pictures here, you've got the picture on the left of a rider who's got their lower leg is properly engaged and the whole rider is in balance, compared to the picture on the right. As soon as the lower leg starts to move in the wrong direction, in particular if you're not already balanced to start with, then what happens is you start to lose balance and security on the horse. Whereas if that lower leg stays in position, the upper body can actually move in almost any direction and the rider will still stay safe and secure on the horse. So, and again, that's when the rider has an independent seat, that can happen. But when a rider doesn't have an independent seat, it only takes one part of the body to move and in the wrong direction, and another part of the body will move to compensate that. But first of all, we have to, as I said, start at the bottom of the body, right down at the feet, and get those as secure as possible, and then we can start to work upwards until the rider develops a truly independent seat. So just to go sideways slightly, I want you to just think also about the rider's centre of gravity. So, and this all ties in with getting the lower legs working as well as possible. Now, the centre of gravity on a human is around the navel area. So directly inwards from your navel, in the middle of your body there, is what's called the centre of gravity. So that means if you were suddenly to be turned into cardboard and somebody stuck a pin into you at that point, you should spin very easily around that pin because that's the centre of your body mass, okay? Now on a horse, their centre of gravity is actually, if you imagine yourself sitting on a horse, and imagine the line between your knee and your hips. About halfway between those 2 points, directly inwards, is the horse's centre of gravity. It used to be thought that it was much lower down, but we now know that the horse's centre of gravity is a bit higher. So it's a bit above your knees and slightly back of your knees, basically, the horse's centre of gravity. Now, put simply, one way of keeping yourself on a horse is if you can keep your centre of gravity as close to their centre of gravity as possible, then it's almost impossible to fall off. Or put another way, it's when your centre of gravity moves too far away from their centre of gravity that you start to start that process of actually parting company or falling off. Okay, so it's all about keeping your centre of gravity as low as possible, and in my clinics this is what I concentrate on in particular, is keeping that centre of gravity low. So how your lower legs behave is absolutely crucial to keeping that centre of gravity low. So your lower legs should be engaged. So by that I mean they should be directly underneath your hips. They should be primed with your ankles slightly flexed. So what I mean is they're ready for action. By that what I'm meaning is that the heel should be able to move in either direction from that point. So if you look at this picture here, the heel is very, very slightly lower than the toes. It's not rammed down too far, and it's not above the toes. Okay, that is where your heel should be. When your heels are in that position, your legs are primed, if you like. They're engaged. As soon as the heel comes above the toes, the leg starts to disengage. I'll show you a picture of this in a minute. So when your legs are in this position, they are, as I would describe them, they are your anchors. Think of them as your anchors. They should be relatively still. So there will be a certain amount of movement just for giving leg aids, but basically they pretty much should stay still. And they should be able to apply the aids, the cues, signals effectively. So that's what your lower legs should be able to do. So they're doing quite a few jobs all at the same time. So they should not be disengaged. The picture at the top right there shows a very typical disengaged leg where the legs have started to come upwards. They shouldn't flap. They shouldn't be stuck too far forward, such as in the picture at the bottom right there. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. They shouldn't stick out and stick forward like the picture on the bottom left, tilt too far back, or be ineffective. So lower legs can do all sorts of things to not be correct, but it's important that we get our lower legs as correct as possible. They are the most important part of your riding anatomy. So without a stable and engaged lower leg, your upper body has to compensate by moving around more in order to balance you. So as soon as the leg comes back, notice how in that picture on the left there, the rider then typically starts to tip forward. Everything then is now starting to go onto a downward spiral. She hasn't yet lost a stirrup, but she's in danger of losing a stirrup and so on. She's probably starting to grip with her knees. Compare to the same rider further on in the lesson and how different her leg looks. And that's because she now has an engaged lower leg. Huge improvement. And you know, improved in so many ways, and the horse is much happier to carry her as well. So that's a good example of a disengaged and an engaged lower leg. So just talking a little bit about position of the legs. Sitting on a horse as if you're sitting on a chair, so in this picture left, it makes a rider much more difficult to carry because a horse's back is weaker the further back it goes. So the nearer you get down the spine of a horse, the weaker it gets. Basically, the front of just behind the withers is the strongest part of the horse's back because those ribs go all the way round and join onto the sternum, so that the back is relatively strong there. When you get further back along the horse's back, you get towards the floating ribs, same as what we have, where they're just floating ribs, they're not joined onto anything, and the back becomes very weak at that point. So we should always try and get ourselves, that's another reason that we should keep ourselves forward and over their centre of gravity, because they're stronger there and it makes you much easier to carry. So in this picture here, this rider is not being helped at all by her saddle, and that's because it's a forward cut jumping saddle, and what it's doing is it's pulling her legs forward, making it almost impossible for her to sit tall. So with this rider, I could go along and put her leg into the correct position, but immediately it's going to go back into that position again. Excuse me. So, and that's because that saddle is made for jumping, where the rider is actually meant to stand up in the stirrups and hover over the withers of the horse to jump. It's not made for sitting in a balanced position for flat work. So looking at these pictures here, so we've got on the left there, rider with their leg too far forward. On the right, the rider with the leg in the correct position. But the picture in the middle is just showing you the difference between a dressage saddle, that's the one on the left, and a more of an all-purpose or jumping saddle on the right. The dressage saddle has the stirrup bar, generally speaking, and particularly in modern dressage saddles, set further back, so that the rider's leg can hang directly underneath the hip quite easily. In fact, in good modern dressage saddles, it's almost impossible to get your leg in the wrong position because these days they are so well made in terms of putting the rider in the right position. Whereas the saddle on the right, notice how the stirrup bar is set further forward, so it's constantly pulling the rider's leg a bit further forward. So that's just another example. So your saddle does go a long way to putting you in that correct balanced position. So another way of thinking of it is that you should be sitting or actually standing across a horse in such a way that if your horse were to disappear in a puff of smoke, you would land on the ground in exactly the same position and you would be perfectly balanced. So, whereas if your legs are actually too far forward, if you imagine sitting there with your legs too far forward and the horse disappeared in a puff of smoke, you would land on the ground and immediately fall backwards. Whereas when you have this correct balanced position, your legs are directly underneath you and you would land on the ground perfectly upright, just with your knees slightly bent. So keep that image in mind as well as we carry on. Losing the stirrups, this happens a lot with inexperienced riders, but also with riders when they're feeling less than confident. So another way of thinking about it is developing as a rider involves learning to do the absolute opposite of what your brain is telling you to do. So when a beginner rides a horse, their brain is telling them to bring their hands into the chest, to bring the knees up into the chest, and so on. Because what the brain is doing is telling the rider to get into the fetal position, because it's not taking into account that the rider is on a horse. Becoming a good rider is about learning to override that very, very strong and basic instinct. It's about when things start to go wrong, when for instance, you might start to feel that the horse is jumping around, for instance, or whatever. It's about making yourself do the absolute opposite of that, because going into that fetal position, bringing the hands up and the knees up, is the worst thing you can do on a horse that's jumping around or even just bouncing you around or whatever. It's the worst thing you can do. So learning to ride is about overriding that very basic instinct. But again, when we lose our confidence, those instincts start to take over again. So again, some riders, even though they know they're not meant to do it, as soon as they start to feel nervous, they'll start to bring their hands nearer the chest, they'll start to lean over their hands, and they'll start to grip with their knees and start to bring their knees up. So it's a very common problem, and as I say, it's all about learning to override those basic instincts. So in particular, looking at the knees, why we should not grip with the knees. And this is actually the issue of gripping with the knees is actually a twofold problem. One, in the olden days, if you like, we were taught to grip with the knees. So it's not that long ago that people were taught to ride by riding with something between the knee and the saddle and told to keep it there. They were actually being told to grip with the knees, thinking that gripping actually kept the rider on the horse, whereas we now know from the study of rider biomechanics that that is not at all what keeps the rider on the horse. What keeps the rider on the horse is keeping their centre of gravity low, keeping their weight travelling all the way down their legs, down into their feet and out through their heels. That's what keeps you on a horse. So in these pictures here, what you can see is the picture on the left. You can see how the weight of the rider is coming down the leg, but because she's gripping with the knee, what's happening is it's stopping at that point and then it's starting to push her back up off the horse, whereas that arrow should actually be able to continue all the way down her leg, but it can't because she's stopping it at that point where she's gripping with the knees. If you look at the picture on the right, again, what's happening there is that because the rider is gripping with their knees, what you in effect have is a triangle on top of a semicircle, and what's happening is all it does is pop the rider, squeeze the rider up and off that semicircle. If you look at the horse and rider in cross section there, again, that weight should be going all the way down into the feet and out through the heels, so it should be being able to be absorbed into the hips, knees, and in particular the ankles. But if it stops at the knees, the ankles are not being allowed to do what they need to do, which is to absorb that energy and into themselves, into the joint. They can't do that if you're gripping with the knees. So it's particularly important that we don't grip with the knees. So how can we improve the stability of the lower legs? So in the books and in my riders clinic, we do quite a lot of this exercise that I'm going to show you now. We start in the walk, we build up to trot, and then for some riders we can even work into canter as well. But we're just going to talk about walk and trot for now in this webinar. So basically, what we do is we start to practice the balance position, and we can start that in halt, and then we work up to doing it in walk. So if you look at the picture on the left there, this is somebody who's in the correct, well, it's drawing, in the correct balance position. You can see that the rider's leaning forward slightly, but you can see that the weight is going down through the legs and right into the heel. The heel is slightly lower than the toes, and so that's all in the correct position. The rider in the middle, the first graph of the rider, in this picture here, her stirrups are just ever so slightly too long. They're not an awful lot too long, but they're just slightly too long, which means that she's just straightening her knee just a little bit too much. So when you try this out at home, if you try this out, you need to play around with the length of your stirrups. Now, in particular, I find that most riders tend to ride too long. Very occasionally they ride too short, but more often than not, riders tend to ride with their stirrups too long. And what that means is that right at that moment that you need the stirrups, which is at the top of the rise, if you're doing riding trot, for instance, if your stirrups are too long, your lower leg actually has to disengage in order for you to keep the stirrup, and that shouldn't be happening. So just keep that picture in mind. You'll be seeing a few more pictures like this as we go through. Notice that the rider has a neck strap on. You should always start with the neck strap. I'll show you another picture of that in the next slide. The picture on the right, in this the rider has tried to be too upright and the knees too straight. So compare that to the picture on the left, okay? And so the one on the right is incorrect and the one on the left is correct. So just going on to the neck strap, you can use a breastplate. It does need to be something that you can hook underneath your fingers quite easily and comfortably. If you're using a breastplate, it can sometimes be a better idea to tie a piece of string from one ring to the other so that you've got a piece of string you can hold in your hand rather than that thick bit of leather. The picture in the middle is how we do it in my clinics, where people just use a piece of string tied in a reef knot round the horse's neck. But holding a grab strap on the front of the saddle doesn't work for two reasons. One, it's too far back, so you cannot balance if you're holding on to that because you won't be able to get your weight forward enough. And two, whenever you fasten a grab strap to the front of the saddle, remember that those D-rings on the front of an English style saddle, it's a bit different on Western saddles and stock saddles, but on an English style saddle, they are not generally made to take much weight, so they can very easily just come undone from the saddle. Sometimes they're just held on by a rivet, for instance. So be very careful if you're actually relying on that strap. As some people do to stay on a bucking horse, for instance. It's not made for that. It's actually just made to tie a breastplate to. So just be aware of that. So again, going back to that balance position, it's a good idea to start in halt and work up to trot, work up to walk and then eventually to trot, especially if you're not feeling that confident. When you're in the standstill, what's a good exercise is to initially stand up on your tiptoes, so you stand right up on the balls of your feet, and see how insecure that feels. You'll actually start to wobble as you get right to the top of your foot, and then go from that position to allowing your heel to drop all the way down. And notice how it feels most comfortable somewhere in between the two. It should feel most comfortable when your heel is just slightly lower than your toes, so not as low down as in picture B, and you certainly shouldn't be standing as in picture A. So the correct position is somewhere between the two. Okay, so you just play around with it. In my workshops, in my clinics rather, what I get people to do is play around with different feelings and learn how to memorize what feels correct, because that's how you learn to do things. You need to learn how to what feels right and store that memory. So notice how in these pictures here, as soon as the lower leg goes too far forward, what happens then is the rider will fall backwards. And likewise, as soon as the lower leg goes too far back, the rider will fall forwards. So what's beautiful about this exercise is that it not only teaches you and improves your balance, but it also is a good check for your balance. Meaning, if you ever think to yourself, once you've learned how to do this, if you ever think to yourself, I wonder if my legs are a bit too far forward, all you have to do is go to stand up in the stirrups with your knees and hips and ankles flexed, and if you can't immediately and easily get yourself up out of the saddle into that position, then it means that your lower legs are actually in the wrong position. Or put another way, if your legs are in the correct position, you will be able to get yourself up there very quickly, very easily, and over time you'll be able to stay up there very easily as well. But it does take a little bit of learning how to balance in this position. So just looking at this picture here, so after you've learned how to do that in walk and you're feeling pretty confident in walk, then the next thing is to start working up to trot. So but this picture here is just demonstrating the minimum amount of bend that you will need in your joints in order to be able to stand up and stay balanced in trot. Now, a lot of riders get away with their stirrups being a little bit too long in the walk, but as soon as they start trotting, they realize that the stirrups are actually too long. So in that case, just bring your horse back to walk and take your stirrups up a notch. In my clinics, riders sometimes end up taking their stirrups up 2 or 3 hurls because they've actually been riding with their stirrups too long. You can always take them down again later, but if you want to get those joints working properly, your stirrups need to be on the shorter side rather than on the long side. Not ridiculously short, but just not too long either. So what should happen? So looking at this picture here, again, same as in the walk, but with the movement now that happens in the trot, you will feel it much more. You will tend to feel a stretch down the back of your calf, and it can actually burn a bit. So be very, very careful doing this, but we'll build up to it very, very gradually. Holding onto your neck strap, don't attempt to get rid of your neck strap yet at all. You need to get proficient at this, at least in walk and trot, before you get rid of it, because if nothing else, it saves you banging back down your horse's back or giving him a pull in the mouth or whatever. So what shouldn't happen is, as you can see here, the lower leg is starting to come too far forward, so the rider is falling backwards, but it's good that because she has the neck strap, she's being able to slow that down, so rather than just bang back down onto the horse's back. One way of thinking of it can be, in the picture on the left here, is imagine that you're skiing downhill. So you wouldn't ski downhill with your legs straight, otherwise that would be very comfortable indeed. Instead, you would always have a bend in your legs. So that's the same on a horse. You must keep that bend in your legs, you must stay in that balanced position. So it's pretty much the same position as what you would be in skiing downhill. A good point to keep in mind is that when you do come back down into the saddle, and for some people this can be a real light bulb moment, what you need to do is think kneel down rather than sit down, because what this does is fold the joints down onto the horse, whereas when you think sit down, for some riders that can mean that they just release themselves quickly, their seat goes too far to the back of the saddle and their feet come forward again. So just practice that next time you ride, thinking kneel down rather than sit down, because this also comes in use in my clinics when we're working on the sitting trot, which we're not covering today. So then once you've got proficient at standing and standing balanced in the trot, in what I call the standing trot, the next thing to do is to start to be able to feel each of your heels dip in turn as the horse trots along. So what you will start to feel is that as the horse's, for instance, his hind leg on the left comes forward, what happens is his back dips ever so slightly at that moment on the left, and if you're allowing your weight to travel down your legs properly, you will actually feel your left heel drop slightly more than your right heel at that moment. So when you're doing this correctly, you'll feel left heel, then right heel, then left heel, then right heel, in time with the horse's back dipping from side to side. And again, this comes in useful for the sitting trot later on, because it means that your pelvis is now starting to follow that movement of the horse's back correctly. Okay, so that's the end of this short session. You can read the first chapter of the Horse Riders Mechanic Workbook 1, Your Position, on the website, and the first chapters of Workbook 2. They're both free on the website, the first chapter and first 2 chapters. Plus there's lots of articles on the website for you to read as well. So make sure you get along there and have a look. And that's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for listening.